My father sent me in my sister's place, Rebecca said. Her voice steady even as her hands trembled around the worn leather handle of her valise. I know you were expecting someone else. I know I'm not what you wanted. But I'm what you got, and I won't pretend otherwise. The man standing before her said nothing for a long moment. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved from her face to the letter in her hand, the letter that bore her sister's name. Not hers. Then Caleb Rourke exhaled slowly and looked away. And Rebecca understood that her entire future had just shifted on the thin edge of a stranger's silence. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Rebecca's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The depot at Sagebrush Crossing was barely more than a weathered platform and a rusted sign. But Rebecca Hale had memorized every plank of it over the past 3 hours. She had counted the nails in the nearest post. She had watched a barn swallow build half a nest in the eave above the ticket window and then abandon it. She had read her father's letter 4 times, not because she didn't know what it said, but because she kept hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something less humiliating. They never did. The letter was addressed to Mr. Caleb Rourke of Crosswind Ranch, Sagebrush Crossing, Wyoming Territory. The handwriting was her father's large, confident, completely without apology. It explained that due to unforeseen circumstances, Caroline Hale would be unable to make the journey west at this time, and that her younger sister Rebecca had been sent in her place. The letter assured Mr. Rourke that Rebecca was a capable and sensible young woman who would make herself useful until the matter of the courtship could be properly reconsidered. Useful. That was the word her father had chosen. Not lovely. Not desirable. Not worthy of courtship. Useful. Rebecca folded the letter and pressed it flat against her palm. The July sun bore down on the back of her neck, and she thought about the fact that she was 25 years old, standing alone on a train platform in a territory she had never visited, holding a letter that described her the way you'd describe a borrowed mule. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the creak of dry axles, the heavy knock of hooves on packed dirt, the brief command of a man's voice telling the horses to stop. Rebecca squared her shoulders. She had decided on the train that she would not cry, and she intended to keep that promise to herself. The man who climbed down from the wagon seat was not what she'd expected, though she wasn't sure what exactly she had expected. Tall, certainly tall enough that the brim of his hat caught the high sun and threw a stripe of shadow across his face. Lean through the shoulders in the way of men who worked rather than merely supervised. He wore a plain blue work shirt, trail-dusted pants, and boots that had seen enough seasons to develop character. He was not handsome in the way of the men in the illustrated newspapers her sister kept on her nightstand. He was something more uncomfortable than handsome. He was solid. He was real. He walked toward her with the kind of measured stride that told her he was in no particular hurry and had never been in a particular hurry in his life. When he was close enough that she could see his eyes dark brown, direct, giving nothing away, he stopped and looked at her for a moment that stretched 2 beats longer than was polite. Then he looked at the letter in her hand. Then he looked back at her face. "You're not Caroline Hale," he said. It wasn't a question. And it wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of plain fact, delivered without cruelty, but without any softening either. And it hit Rebecca in the chest, with the precision of something she had known was coming, but had no way to prepare for. "No," she said. "My name is Rebecca. I'm Caroline's younger sister." His expression didn't change, not obviously. But something in his jaw shifted, tightened, then deliberately released. He looked at the letter again, and she could see him reading it without moving his eyes, which meant he had probably already read it twice before he arrived. "Your father sent you," he said. "Yes." "In your sister's place." "Yes." He said nothing for a long moment. He was not looking at her anymore. He was looking somewhere past her left shoulder, at something she couldn't see, and she had the unsettling feeling that whatever was happening behind his eyes was considerably more complicated than his face was letting on. I see, he said finally. Rebecca had rehearsed a number of responses to a number of possible reactions during the 2-day train journey west. She had prepared for anger. She had prepared for contempt. She had even prepared, in her darkest moments of imagination, for something uglier than either. She had not prepared for 2 words spoken with that particular rapt quality of absolute, contained stillness. "Mr. Rourke," she said, because silence seemed worse. "I want to be honest with you from the beginning. I don't know what arrangement my father made with you regarding Caroline, and I don't know exactly what he told you about me. But I want you to know that I had no part in this decision. I was given 3 days' notice and a one-way ticket. Whatever offense has been committed here, I am not the one who committed it." He looked at her then. Really looked at her, in the way that made her resist the urge to step back. "I know that," he said. "I'm not asking for anything," she continued, because she had promised herself she would finish what she'd rehearsed. "I'm not expecting you to honor whatever agreement you made with my father. I have a small amount of money saved. If you could help me arrange lodging in town until the next train east, I'll be out of your way, and you'll never hear from me or my family again." He studied her for another long moment. Then he did something she had not expected at all. He reached out and picked up the larger of her 2 valises. "The next train east doesn't run for 3 weeks, he said. "Come on." He walked toward the wagon. Rebecca stood where she was for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to understand that she had no better options, and that standing on the platform in the Jliche height until she fainted would not improve her situation. Then she picked up her smaller bag and followed him. He had already secured her larger valise in the wagon bed by the time she reached the side of it, and without ceremony or comment, he positioned himself to help her up, not in the fussy, performative way of men who wanted credit for their manners, but in the practical way of someone who understood that a wagon's step was higher than it looked, and that offering a steadying hand was simply the efficient thing to do. They drove in silence for nearly 20 minutes. Rebecca watched the landscape and decided that Wyoming Territory in July looked exactly like the end of the world dry. Enormous, indifferent, and somehow magnificent in a way that had nothing to do with comfort. The sagebrush rolled in every direction. The sky was the particular shade of blue that only exists at altitude, the kind of blue that makes you feel simultaneously small and strangely awake. "You said you had no part in this," Caleb said without looking at her. "But you came anyway." "I was given very little choice," Rebecca said. "A person can always refuse. My father would have lost the mill," she said. "He told me the debt he owes you would have bankrupted our family. I came because someone had to, and Caroline," she stopped. She was not going to speak unkindly about her sister to a stranger. "Caroline was unable to come, unable," he repeated. "That's what I said." He glanced at her then, brief and unreadable, and went back to watching the road. "I owe your family no debt," he said. "The arrangement I made with your father was a courtship agreement. It was not a purchase contract. A woman is not a parcel to be forwarded when the original shipment falls through." Rebecca felt heat climb her face that had nothing to do with the sun. "I'm aware of that, Mr. Rourke. Then you understand why I'm angry. I assumed you were angry because I'm not Caroline." He pulled the wagon to a brief stop to let a small herd of range cattle clear the road, and in the sudden quiet, he turned to look at her directly. "I'm angry," he said, "because your father treated both of us like furniture to be rearranged for his convenience. I've never laid eyes on your sister. I spent 6 months corresponding with your family, making arrangements, paying fair consideration, and now I find out the entire thing was a financial transaction dressed up in courtship clothes." He paused. "I'm not angry because you're the wrong sister. I'm angry because neither of us should be in this position." Rebecca looked at him for a moment. "That's," she said carefully, "a more reasonable response than I expected." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one. "What were you expecting, honestly?" "I wasn't sure. Somewhere between very cold and extremely loud. I save loud for when it's actually useful," he said. He released the brake and started the horses moving again. We'll figure out the rest when we get to the ranch. Crosswind Ranch announced itself not with grandeur but with function, a long fence line that had been recently repaired in sections, a barn that had clearly been rebuilt in the last several years, a bunkhouse with a sagging porch that 3 men were sitting on when the wagon rolled in. The main house was 2 stories, built square and plain, with a covered porch that ran the entire front length. It was not beautiful, but it was serious. It looked like a place where real things happened. The 3 men on the bunkhouse porch stopped talking when the wagon came through the gate. Rebecca felt their attention like a physical thing, not hostile. Exactly, but assessing in the way of men who lived by their ability to read situations quickly. Caleb set the brake with the smooth economy of long habit and climbed down without hurrying. "Hector," he said to the nearest man, a stocky Mexican vaquero with a graying mustache, "put the horses up." He came around to Rebecca's side of the wagon and offered his hand again. "Miss Hale." She climbed down and retrieved her smaller bag from the seat. Caleb pulled her larger valise from the wagon bed and carried it up the porch steps without being asked. Hector and the 2 other hands watched all of this with the careful blankness of men and who had learned that commenting on the boss's business was not a long-term career strategy. But Rebecca caught the quick glance that passed between the 2 younger ones, and she understood it perfectly. They had been told a woman was coming. This was not the woman they'd been told about. Inside, the house was cooler, thick walls that held the night air into the afternoon, she realized, and clean in the sparse way of places maintained by people with more important things to do than dust the mantelpiece. A large table dominated the main room, covered with maps, ledger books, and papers that were clearly in the middle of being sorted. Caleb set her valise at the foot of the stairs. "I'll show you the guest room," he said. "You can wash up. I'll have Maria, she cooks for the ranch. Put something together for supper, Mr. Rourke." He paused. "I want to be clear about something," Rebecca said. "I will not pretend to be here for the reason my father arranged. I have no intention of inserting myself into your life as though I were a substitute for a woman you actually chose. If there's any work I can do to earn my keep until the train comes, I'm willing to do it. But I won't play at being a potential wife when neither of us has any interest in that." He regarded her for a moment, and there was something in his expression she couldn't quite read, not offense, not relief, not quite anything she had a name for. "Honest," he said. It seemed like the only sensible approach. "All right, Miss Hale," he said. "We'll speak plainly with each other. Then get some rest. We'll talk more in the morning." She followed him up the stairs and into a room at the end of the hall, a plain room with a clean quilt on the bed, a washstand with a white pitcher, and a window that looked out over the western pasture. She could see in the far distance a line of cattle moving slowly toward the water trough near the fence line. She stood at that window for a long time after Caleb left. She thought about her father, who had looked her in the eye 3 days ago and told her this was necessary. She thought about Caroline, who had looked her in the eye 6 months ago and said the cowboy from Wyoming sounded nice enough, and who had not said a word when their father began making arrangements. She thought about the letter in her bag, the one bearing her sister's name. Then she thought about Caleb Rourke, who had driven for an hour to collect a woman he'd never met, discovered he'd been deceived, and responded by picking up her heavy bag. She didn't know what to make of any of it, but she was here, and she was not a woman who could afford the luxury of not paying attention. She washed her face, changed her dress, and went back downstairs. The morning came hard and early at Crosswind Ranch, which was the first thing Rebecca learned about the place. By the time the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge, the bunkhouse was empty, the barn doors were open, and somewhere outside a man was arguing with a recalcitrant horse in terms that were anatomically imaginative. Rebecca dressed, braided her hair back from her face the way she wore it when she was working, and went downstairs. She found Maria in the kitchen, a compact, no-nonsense woman somewhere in her 50s who handed Rebecca a cup of coffee and a plate of biscuits without introduction or ceremony. which Rebecca found entirely appropriate. You know how to cook? Maria asked. Adequately, Rebecca said. I'm better with numbers. Maria gave her a long, considering look. Numbers. My father owns a mill. I managed the accounts for 3 years. Maria said nothing to this. But something in her expression shifted slightly toward approval. Caleb was not in the house. Rebecca finished her coffee and found him outside near the barn, deep in a conversation with Hector that stopped in a way that told her it had been about something that wasn't for general audiences. He turned when he heard her step on the gravel. Miss Hale. I was going to come find you after breakfast. I don't sleep late, she said. He studied her for a moment, then nodded once, as though this confirmed something. Walk with me. They walked along the fence line that separated the main yard from the southern pasture, and Caleb spoke in the direct manner of someone who had decided to stop circling a topic. I owe you an apology, he said. Last night I told you I was angry because your father treated us both like furniture. That was true. But the way I said some things at the depot, comparing you to your sister in my mind, letting that show that wasn't fair to you. You deserved better than that. Rebecca looked at him, genuinely surprised. You're apologizing for what you were thinking. I'm apologizing for what I let you see, he said. There's a difference. Most men don't bother with that distinction. Most men aren't me, he said, without arrogance, just as a statement of fact. He stopped walking and turned to face her. I want to offer you something more formal than what we discussed yesterday. A guest room, fair wages, and passage home when the train runs. You'd be free to come and go as you please, and I'd ask nothing of you beyond whatever work you chose to take on. No expectations, no obligation. He paused. No pretending this is something it isn't. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. That's a fair offer. You don't have to decide anything today, he said. Just tell me what you need. What she needed, she thought, was an answer to the question that had been pressing against the back of her mind since the previous afternoon. She had not asked it yet because she hadn't been sure she was ready for the answer. She decided she was ready now. Mr. Rourke, she said. What happened with the water? He went very still. What makes you ask that? Last night, she said, while you and Hector were in the barn, I was waiting in the main room. The ledger books on the table, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have looked. I didn't read them exactly. I know what a supply ledger looks like. And some of the entries for Watergate timber didn't match the quantities I'd expect from the price columns. She watched his face carefully. And this morning I noticed that 2 of the troughs in the south yard were empty. In July, that seems wrong. Caleb was looking at her, with an expression she was beginning to recognize, that particular quality of stillness that meant he was reassessing something. You read supply ledgers, he said. I read everything, she said. My father's mill accounts, water channel logs, livestock records, freight manifests. When you manage accounts for a working operation, you learn to notice when numbers don't fit. Another long pause. Then come inside. He spread the ledgers across the dining table and watched while Rebecca went through them with the quiet, methodical focus of someone who had been doing this since she was a girl. She asked 2 questions, one about the freight company and one about the Watergate contracts, and Caleb answered both. And then she was silent for a long time. Someone is charging you for timber you're not receiving, she said finally. Look. She turned the ledger to face him and pointed to a column of figures. These entries for June you paid for 800 board feet of gate frame timber. But the construction notes in the margin only account for about 500. 300 board feet disappeared between the invoice and the installation. Caleb stared at the column. His jaw was doing that thing again. That's been going on for 4 months, he said. At least, she said. I'd need to check back further to know when it started. But the pattern is, she hesitated, tracing a line of figures with her finger. Careful. It's not greedy. Whoever is doing this is taking just enough that it's not immediately obvious. They know what they're doing. They'd have to know the ranch, he said quietly. Or have access to someone who does. They looked at each other across the table. And in that moment, something shifted between them, not romantic. Nothing so simple. It was more like the feeling of two people discovering that they are, against all expectation, working in the same direction. I want to look at the water maps, Rebecca said. If the ledger charges are being manipulated, the water records might be too. Why? Because if I were going to bleed a ranch dry, she said, I wouldn't just steal timber money. I'd cut off the water too. It took her until after supper to find it. Caleb had brought her the water map's original survey documents from when Crosswinds Creek access had been established, alongside the more recent records of the Watergate system. Rebecca worked through them the way she worked through everything, which was carefully and without distraction, and when she found the discrepancy, she felt it in the same place she always felt it, when numbers lied to her, a cold, clear drop of certainty in the center of her chest. Caleb, she said. He looked up from the far end of the table, where he had been reviewing cattle records. She pointed to two maps laid side by side. This is your original survey from 1878. The creek feeds into Crosswind from the northeast. Here, and your water rights are established at this gate point. She moved her finger to the second map. This is the amended survey from 1882. Someone redrew the gate point. It's subtle, only about 40 yards, but the new location would put your primary intake just below where another channel could be diverted upstream. She paused. If someone built a diversion upstream of your intake, you'd still be receiving water from your legal source, but the volume would be half what it should be. Caleb stood up slowly, walked to her side of the table, and looked at where her finger rested on the map. In a drought year, he said. In a drought year, she confirmed. You'd lose cattle. The silence that followed was not quiet. It was the particular loud kind of silence that comes when something that was suspected suddenly becomes known. When suspicion hardens into fact and the mind begins calculating the implications faster than words can follow. Vernon Shaw, Caleb said. It was not a question. Rebecca looked at him. I don't know that name. He's a cattle investor. He has the land upstream. Caleb's voice was controlled, very controlled, in the manner of a man who had learned to be careful with his anger. He's approached me twice in the last year about buying Crosswind. I said no both times. Did he have access to your water maps? He had access to the county survey office, Caleb said. Anyone does. Then someone with access to both the survey office and your supply invoices has been setting up this ranch to fail, Rebecca said. And they've been doing it long enough that by the time the drought hits hard, and it's going to, looking at those creek levels, you won't have enough water to keep the herd alive. Caleb was staring at the maps. Something moved through his face, something that was not quite fear and not quite rage, but contained elements of both, compressed into something that looked from the outside like absolute stillness. How long do we have? He said. Rebecca looked at the numbers. She did the calculation twice. If the current diversion is what I think it is, and the drought continues, she said, you have 6 weeks before you start losing cattle. Maybe 8 if we can improve the distribution. He said. She looked up at him. If you want my help. He held her gaze for a moment. And then he sat down across from her and pulled the ledger back to his side of the table. Tell me what you need, he said. It was the same thing he'd said to her that morning. And it meant the same thing, not a favor, not a charity, not a man making room for someone who needed taking care of. It was the question of someone who had identified a partner and intended to treat her like one. Rebecca felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Something that didn't have a convenient name but felt, in its general shape, like the possibility that things might not turn out the way she'd assumed. I need access to all the records going back to 1880, she said. And I need to talk to your ranch hands about the water distribution schedule. Done, he said. And I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing. He looked at her steadily. I already do, he said. Outside the window, the night pressed down on Wyoming territory with the weight of a sky full of stars. And somewhere out in the dark, The water level in Crosswinds Creek was dropping by degrees too small to measure, too real to ignore. 3 days passed in a rhythm that Rebecca hadn't expected and didn't entirely know what to do with. She worked at the dining room table from early morning until the light failed, and Caleb rode the boundary lines and came back in the evenings and sat across from her and asked questions she answered, and asked her questions she answered differently. And by the end of the 3rd day, she had produced a 4-page summary of everything she'd found, written in the clear, organized hand she'd developed, keeping her father's accounts. The ranch hands were a different matter. Tom Briggs was the oldest of the regular crew, a rawboned Texan in his late 40s, who had been working cattle since before Rebecca was born, and who held the particular opinion, common among men of his generation and profession, that the best solution to most problems was to do the thing you'd always done, and wait for the problem to go away. When Caleb told him that Rebecca was going to revise the water distribution schedule, Tom Briggs looked at her the way you'd look at a slightly dangerous weather event that you hoped would track south. "We've been running the same schedule for 4 years," he said. "It works. It worked when you had full water pressure," Rebecca said, with the particular patience she'd developed dealing with the men at her father's mill who believed that years of doing something wrong constituted expertise. "Right now you're distributing equally to all sections of the pasture, which means the weakest cattle, the ones who can't compete at the trough, are getting water last when pressure is lowest. In a normal year, that's inefficient. In a drought year, it's a death sentence for your smallest animals." Tom Briggs looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Rebecca. "Show him the numbers," Caleb said. Rebecca showed him the numbers. She walked Tom Briggs through the calculation with the same calm she would have used explaining a freight manifest to one of her father's delivery men. No condescension, no performance of patience, just the numbers themselves, speaking clearly in the language of things that were true. Tom Briggs looked at the numbers for a long moment. "Huh," he said. "Huh," Rebecca agreed. "That'll save about twice as much water as the current schedule," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's what it'll do." Tom Briggs scratched the back of his neck and looked at Caleb again. But this time differently, not seeking permission, but offering a verdict. "Boss," he said, "I think we ought to let her run the distribution." Caleb said, "I think so too." On the 4th evening, while they were drinking coffee on the porch and waiting for the temperature to drop enough to sleep, Caleb said, "Tell me about your father's mill." It was the first time he'd asked her anything personal. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, deciding how much of the truth she wanted to give him. She gave him most of it. She told him about the accounts, the water channels, the livestock records. She told him about the years she'd spent learning to read freight manifests and supply ledgers, while Caroline learned to play the piano and receive visitors in the good parlor. She told him that she had understood from a young age that her father considered her the less valuable daughter, not because he was a cruel man, but because he was a practical one, and practicality had told him that a plain, capable daughter was a worker, while a beautiful daughter was an asset. She did not tell him how much that had cost her. She didn't think that was any of his business yet. "He used you," Caleb said. "Not unkindly, just plainly." "He used both of us," she said, "just differently." Caleb said nothing for a moment. He was looking out at the dark line of the fence, and she could tell he was thinking about something specific. "My father ran this ranch," he said, "before me. He was a man who believed that owning something meant controlling it. The land, the cattle, the people who worked for him." He paused. "My mother left when I was 12. She didn't say goodbye. Just gone one morning." Another pause. "I spent a long time being angry at her for that. Then I spent a long time understanding why she did it." Rebecca looked at him. "I decided," he said, "that whatever kind of man I became, I wasn't going to be that kind." "You don't strike me as that kind," she said. "No," he said, "I hope not." He picked up his coffee cup, looked at it, set it back down. "My father would have thrown you back on the next train and written an angry letter to your father and told the whole county he'd been cheated. He would have made it your fault somehow. Instead, you apologized to me, Rebecca said. Instead, I tried to, he said, though I'm not sure I managed it very well. You managed it well enough, she said. They sat in silence for a while, and it was not comfortable exactly, but honest, which Rebecca thought was probably better than comfortable. Then, from inside the house, came the sound of Maria's voice, calling that there was a telegram at the door. Rebecca felt the change in Caleb's stillness, immediately a different quality of alertness. The kind that preceded bad news. He went inside. She heard him speak briefly to the boy who'd ridden out from town. She heard the door close. When he came back to the porch, he was holding a folded piece of paper, and his face had gone back to that contained, unreadable expression she was beginning to understand, meant that something was wrong, and he was deciding what to do about it. Is it bad? She asked. He handed her the telegram without speaking. It was addressed to her. It was from Caroline. 4 words and a warning. Father lied to us both. Shaw is coming. Do not sign anything. Rebecca read it twice. Then she read it a third time. Because the particular quality of Caroline's panic, measurable even in telegraph code, made her want to understand exactly how frightened her sister was before she responded to it. She looked up at Caleb. How much do you know about Vernon Shaw? Enough, he said. Then we need to talk, she said. Tonight. Because I think whatever Shaw is planning, it's already in motion. She looked at the telegram again. Then at the ledgers waiting on the table inside. And I think the evidence of it is already in your books. Caleb's jaw set in that tight, deliberate way. Then let's go find it. They went back inside, and the night deepened around Crosswind Ranch, and in the south pasture the cattle troughs held exactly as much water as Rebecca had calculated they should, which was not enough. But more than yesterday, and somewhere upstream in the dark, a channel was diverting what should have been Crosswind's water away to somewhere it had no right to be. But inside, 2 people who had not planned on finding each other were bent over the same ledger, working toward the same truth, and the light from the lamp between them burned steady and clear through the long Wyoming night. It was nearly midnight when Rebecca found the invoice that changed everything. She almost missed it. It was filed between 2 routine freight receipts from the previous October, and whoever had placed it there had been counting on exactly that, the eye sliding past it on the assumption that October freight receipts were October freight receipts, nothing more. But the handwriting on the authorization signature at the bottom was not Caleb's, and it was not the freight company's representative. Rebecca recognized it the way you recognize something you've tried not to look at directly sideways. Suddenly, all at once, she had grown up watching that handwriting sign mill receipts, property deeds, and letters of credit. She had seen it on the document that had authorized her passage west. She had seen it on every important piece of paper in her father's office for the last 10 years. Her hand was completely steady when she turned the page to face Caleb. This invoice, she said. Her voice was steady, too. The authorization signature. Do you recognize this handwriting? Caleb leaned forward and looked. He looked for a long time. Then he looked at her, and his expression told her he understood exactly what she was telling him. That's Josiah Hale's signature, she said. My father's. On an invoice for the Watergate materials that never arrived at your ranch. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had heard since she stepped off the train. Your father, Caleb said slowly, is connected to Shaw. My father, Rebecca said, may be how Shaw has been accessing your supply invoices. She forced herself to keep looking at the signature. To keep looking at the evidence of what her father had done. Not just to her, not just the substitution, the bargain, the one-way ticket west, but this deliberate, methodical participation in the theft of another man's livelihood. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't know. I swear to you I had no idea. I know that, Caleb said. Quietly, without hesitation. You can't know that. I know enough about you already to know that, he said. You've been working to save my ranch for 4 days. If you'd known about this, you wouldn't be sitting at my table at midnight helping me find it. Rebecca looked at him. Caleb, she said. And it was the first time she'd used his given name. And she noticed that he noticed. Whatever happens from here with Shaw, with the water, with my father, I want you to know that I intend to see this through. Whatever the truth is, whatever it costs, I'm going to help you find it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out and moved the lamp slightly closer to the page, so that the ink on her father's signature stood out, stark and clear, against the pale paper. Then let's find it, he said. And outside in the Wyoming dark, the creek kept running thinner now than it should have been. Diverted by someone who believed that Crosswind Ranch could be quietly dismantled before anyone noticed. He had not counted on Rebecca Hale noticing. He had not counted on her at all. The morning after they found Josiah Hale's signature on that invoice, neither of them spoke about it at breakfast. They didn't need to. The paper was still on the table where they'd left it, and it sat there between the coffee cups and the biscuit plate, like something alive, like something that was going to require a decision before the day was out. Rebecca ate quickly, refilled her own coffee, and went back to the ledgers without being asked. Caleb watched her for a moment from the kitchen doorway, then put on his hat and went out to find Hector. She appreciated that about him more than she could easily say. He didn't hover. He didn't check on her every 20 minutes the way men did when they weren't sure whether to trust you. He gave her the work and let her do it, and that simple act, treating her competence as a fact rather than a pleasant surprise, was something she hadn't experienced enough times in her life to take for granted. By mid-morning, she had traced the pattern back 14 months. It wasn't just the Watergate timber. The fraudulent charges ran through 4 separate supply categories: fencing materials, freight costs, Watergate hardware, and a line item labeled simply survey consultation fees that appeared every 3 months with perfect regularity and corresponded to exactly nothing Rebecca could find in the actual ranch records. Someone had been bleeding Crosswind steadily and carefully for over a year, never taking enough in any single month to trigger immediate alarm, always hiding the charges inside legitimate invoices, always leaving just enough paper trail to look at a glance. Like ordinary operational complexity, it was masterful. In the way that certain kinds of theft are masterful, the kind that requires patience, knowledge, and a complete absence of conscience. When Caleb came back in at noon, she had 6 pages of notes laid out in order on the table, and she walked him through every one of them without preamble. He listened without interrupting, which she was learning was his way. He stood beside the table with his arms crossed, not defensively, but as someone arranging himself to receive information he needed to hold steady for, and he read each page she pointed to and absorbed it in the silence she gave him. When she finished, he said, "How much? In total?" "Over 14 months?" She showed him the final column. "Somewhere between $1,200 and $1,500, depending on how the survey fees were actually structured." His expression didn't collapse, but something in it tightened to a point she could feel from across the table. "That's nearly 2 full seasons of cattle profit," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "And my father's signature," he said. Not a question, just making himself say it out loud. The way you sometimes have to make yourself say the true thing before you can figure out what to do with it. "Your father's signature," she confirmed, "on at least 4 of the fraudulent invoices. Which means either your father knew he was authorizing payments for goods and services that didn't exist." She stopped. She was not going to soften this. Or someone forged his signature on 4 separate documents. Which is possible, but less likely given that the handwriting is. She paused, choosing her word with care, consistent, not labored. "Someone who writes that signature regularly." Caleb uncrossed his arms. He walked to the window, stood there with his back to her for a moment, and then turned around. "My father is not a dishonest man," he said. "I know you believe that. I believe it because I know him." "Then help me understand," she said. "How his signature appears on 4 invoices authorizing payments to a company that, as far as I can determine, does not exist." The silence that followed had a specific texture, the silence of a man confronting the gap between what he knows of someone and what the evidence says about them. The terrible and specific quiet of that moment before understanding arrives and everything rearranges. Shaw, Caleb said. Shaw had access to my father when he was trying to negotiate the first purchase offer. Dad met with him twice. They had dinner, he stopped. Shaw could have gotten a sample of his writing. That's possible, Rebecca said. She didn't say it was probable. She left the space there. Or Caleb said, and his voice was careful now, careful in the way you are when you're moving through territory where the ground might not hold. My father was more desperate for cash than he told me. And Shaw offered him an arrangement. Rebecca didn't respond to that. She picked up her coffee cup, which was long cold, and held it in both hands the way she did when she needed something to do with her hands, while she thought. Whatever the truth is, she said finally, we need to know it before Shaw arrives. Because if he's coming here and Caroline clearly believes he is, then he's coming with something. Documents, probably. A legal claim of some kind. And if we don't know exactly what the fraud consists of, we can't refute whatever he presents. Caleb looked at her across the table. You've done this before. Done what? Untangled someone's dishonesty through their paperwork. She thought about her father's mill. About the afternoon 3 years ago when she discovered that their freight hauler had been padding his invoices for 18 months, and she had sat alone at the account desk for 2 hours before she brought the evidence to her father. And her father had said, "Good girl, Becca," which had been both his highest compliment and the most dismissive thing he could have said. And somehow, both those things were true at the same time. Once, she said, "Then you know what we're looking at." "I know what the paper says," she told him. "The paper says someone with access to your ranch accounts and your family's signatures has been systematically preparing Crosswind to fail. Whether that was your father's choice or someone else's crime, the result is the same. Your operation is being undermined from the inside. Your water is being diverted from the outside, and by the time the drought hits full force, both those things together will make it look like Crosswind is a mismanaged ranch bleeding money, rather than a profitable operation being deliberately destroyed." She set down the coffee cup. And then Shaw makes his offer to purchase. At a price that reflects a failing ranch. Caleb sat down. He sat down the way tall men sometimes do when something lands hard, not collapsing, but allowing gravity its due, settling into the weight of what he now understood. "He's been planning this for over a year," he said. "At least. Possibly longer. While I was," he gestured vaguely, "running the ranch. Making cattle decisions. Thinking the biggest problem was the drought." "The drought is what he was counting on," Rebecca said. "A drought year is when a diverted water supply becomes a disaster instead of an inconvenience." He timed this. Caleb put his hand flat on the table. He looked at the stack of ledgers. He looked at Rebecca's 6 pages of notes in her clear, organized hand. "What do you need from me?" he said. And there it was again, that question, that particular question, which she was learning was how Caleb Rourke communicated respect. Not "what should we do?" Not "here's what I've decided." "What do you need from me?" as in, "You're the one who knows this territory and I'm here to support the work." "I need to talk to Hector," she said, "about the physical water situation, where exactly the levels are lowest. Whether he's seen anything upstream, whether any of the fencing near Shaw's property line has been disturbed. What's in the ledgers tells me what was planned. What's on the ground will tell me what's actually happening. I'll take you out this afternoon," he said. "We'll ride the northern boundary." She looked at him. "I don't ride well." "I'll drive," he said. "No different than the depot." She thought about objecting on principle and decided it wasn't worth it. "All right." And Caleb, again she used his name, and again she noticed him register it while we're doing that. "I need you to think honestly about your father, not what you want to believe. What you actually know." He held her gaze. "I know," he said quietly. "Because if he's involved, if it's not forgery, we need to know that before Shaw gets here. Not after." "I said I know," he repeated, still quiet. Steadier this time. She picked up her pen and went back to the numbers. Outside, Tom Briggs was already implementing the revised water distribution schedule with the focused energy of a man who had been proven wrong and decided that the most dignified response was to be aggressively correct from here forward. She could hear him through the window, directing the younger hands with a precision that told her the calculations had sunk in overnight. She thought, that's something at least. Then she went back to the ledgers, because there was still more in them that she hadn't found yet. She could feel it, the particular instinct she'd developed over 3 years of accounts work, the sense of a number that was hiding, that was trying to look like something it wasn't. She had learned to trust that instinct the way you learn to trust the sound of ice that isn't quite solid, the way the sound changes before the surface gives way. She trusted it now, and she kept reading. She found the second thing 2 hours later. It was in the survey consultation fees, the third quarterly payment, from the previous spring. Unlike the others, which were authorized with her father's signature, this one carried a different name entirely, a notary stamp from the county land office, and a parcel number that matched, when she cross-referenced it with Caleb's original property survey, a 16-acre strip along the Northern Creek boundary. A strip that, according to the original survey, was indisputably part of Crosswind Ranch. According to the amended consultation record, it had been resurveyed and reclassified as disputed public land. She sat very still for a moment. Then she called for Caleb. He came in from the yard, and she showed him the parcel number and the original survey and the amended record, and she watched his face move through 3 distinct expressions in about 4 seconds: confusion, comprehension, and then a cold, focused anger that was completely different from the hot, reactive kind. This was the anger of a man who had understood something and was deciding, with absolute precision, what he intended to do about it. That strip, he said. That's where the creek narrows, where the intake gate sits. I know, she said. If that land is classified as disputed, Shaw could argue that any water infrastructure on it, including the intake gate, is subject to public land regulation, which means he could apply to have the gate moved or decommissioned, which would cut off your primary water supply entirely. She finished. Not just divert it. Eliminate it. In the middle of a drought, he said. In the middle of a drought, she confirmed. He straightened up from the table. He walked to the window again, that same measured walk. And she understood now that it wasn't restlessness, it was how he thought. How he moved through problems that required his whole body to process. He needed the space, the few feet between himself and the evidence, to arrange what he knew into what he was going to do. We have to get to the county judge before Shaw does, he said. We have to get the evidence organized first, she said. If we go to the judge with a stack of ledgers and a theory, we get politely listened to and nothing happens. If we go with a documented case, numbered invoices, cross-referenced surveys, the parcel reclassification, and a clear timeline, then we have something. He turned around. How long? 2 days, she said. Maybe 3. Shaw could arrive any time. Then we work fast, she said. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he nodded once. The way he did when he'd made a decision, and was fully inside it. I'll get Hector to double the watch on the northern fence, he said. If Shaw's men are building anything upstream, I want to know before they finish it. He paused at the door. Rebecca, she looked up. Thank you, he said. Not the casual thank you of someone completing a transaction. The other kind, weighted, deliberate, the kind that means something real, is being recognized. She turned back to her work before he could see what that did to her expression. That evening, they ate supper together at the dining room table, surrounded by organized stacks of documents, which was not a romantic circumstance and which Rebecca found, inexplicably, one of the most comfortable meals she'd had in years. Maria made a beef stew that was considerably better than anything available in her father's house. And Hector joined them briefly to report that one of the younger hands had found disturbed ground near the northern fence line, recently turned earth, deliberately concealed with brush, in a pattern consistent with channel digging. How wide? Narrow, Hector said, but long. Goes north probably 200 yards before the brush gets too thick to follow. Long enough for a diversion channel, Rebecca said without looking up. Long enough, Hector confirmed. He glanced at her sideways. Not with hostility, more with the expressions of a man revising an assessment in real time. You know water channels? My father's mill ran on water channels, she said. I grew up reading them. Hector looked at Caleb. Something passed between them. There's an old drainage cut, Hector said slowly. On the eastern edge of the south pasture. We stopped using it 3 years ago because it silted up. If someone cleaned it out and redirected it, it could serve as an emergency bypass, Rebecca said. Gravity fed from where? From the secondary creek feed. About a quarter-mile east. It's lower volume, but in drought conditions. Lower volume and reliable beats high volume and compromised, she said. She finally looked up and found both men looking at her with that particular expression. She'd learned to read the expression. That meant the calculation had landed. If we clean out that drainage cut and redirect it to the main trough system, we can keep the weakest cattle alive, even if Shaw manages to interfere with the primary intake. Hector looked at Caleb. Boss, do it, Caleb said. Start tomorrow morning. Take whoever you need from the day crew. Hector nodded. Put down his coffee cup and went out. The screen door swung shut behind him. And in the sudden quiet, Caleb looked across the supper things at Rebecca. You designed a gravity-fed channel from a description, he said. In about 30 seconds. My father built 3 of them before I was 15, she said. I watched everyone. I helped with the second 2. She picked up her fork. Eat your supper before it gets cold. We've got at least 2 more hours of work after this. He smiled at that. A real one, brief and unguarded, gone almost before she was sure she'd seen it. But real. The first real one she'd seen from him, and it changed his face in a way she was not entirely prepared for. She looked back at her stew and decided that noticing things like that was not useful at this particular juncture. They worked until almost midnight again. Caleb sat across from her and organized the documents into the sequence she requested. And she wrote the summary of the fraud in the clear. Systematic language of someone who understood that a good argument is architecture, every supporting fact in its load-bearing place. Nothing decorative, nothing wasted. At one point, he leaned over to look at what she was writing, and his shoulder nearly touched hers. And neither of them moved away, and Rebecca kept writing. Your handwriting is better than mine, he said. Most people's is, she said. I'll write the letter to the county judge, he said. You'll need to sign it too, as the person who compiled the evidence. That might complicate things, she said. A woman who arrived at your ranch under suspicious circumstances. Signing a legal complaint against a neighboring landowner. A woman who arrived at my ranch as a legitimate temporary bookkeeper, he said, who discovered evidence of fraud in the course of her professional duties. He said it steadily, without drama. That's what you are, Rebecca. That's what this is. Anyone who tries to make it into something else will have to do it in front of a county judge. And they're welcome to try. She looked at him. All right, she said. Good. He went back to organizing documents. After a moment, she said, Caleb, why did you start the courtship arrangements with my family? Not with some other family. He was quiet for a beat. My foreman at the time before Hector had arranged a similar situation a few years back. He said it worked out well, that the arrangement being honest about the practical nature of it. Being clear about expectations was sometimes better than courtship that pretended to be purely romantic and turned out to be mostly financial anyway. He paused. My own experience with more conventional courtship had not been particularly successful. What happened? Another pause. Longer this time. A woman in Cheyenne. 3 years ago. I thought we were building towards something. She married a man with a larger ranch and a house in town. He said it without bitterness. Which told her the bitterness had been processed thoroughly, at some point, and put somewhere quiet. It wasn't her fault. I think I was more in love with the idea of being the kind of man who was settled and ready for a family than I was with her specifically. Rebecca absorbed this. And yet, she said carefully, a courtship arrangement with a stranger seemed like the solution. It seemed honest, he said. More honest than what I'd been doing before. He looked up. I was wrong, as it turned out. About a lot of things, not about honesty, she said. No, he said. Not about that. They went back to work, and the ranch settled around them into its nighttime sounds. And somewhere, out in the south pasture, the new water distribution was holding. And, in the morning, Hector would start clearing the drainage cut. And the evidence on the table between them was growing more organized by the hour. And Rebecca did not think about any of what Caleb had said or the way he'd said it, because she had decided that thinking about those things was a distraction she could not afford. She thought about them anyway, briefly, when she blew out her lamp at midnight and lay in the dark guest room listening to the Wyoming night. Then she set them aside and went over the numbers in her head, instead the column totals. The invoice dates, the survey parcel number, arranging them into the clean architecture of a case that would be very difficult to argue against. She was good at this, she thought. This she was genuinely good at. She fell asleep with the numbers still moving in an orderly way behind her eyes. The next morning, Caleb left a lantern beside her ledgers before she came downstairs. She found it there still warm, freshly filled with oil, positioned so the light would fall exactly where she'd been working the night before. There was no note. There didn't need to be. It was the kind of thing you did when you had noticed where someone sat and how they worked and what they needed before they knew they needed it. And it was the kind of thing that would have been, in another context, entirely too much to read into. Rebecca lit the lantern and opened the ledgers and did not read into it. An hour later, she went to find Caleb's torn work glove lying on the porch rail, left there from the fence repair the previous day. The right-hand seam split badly enough that it would raise a blister by noon. She took it inside, found Maria's sewing basket without asking, and stitched it closed with the same neat, functional stitching she'd used on her father's mill aprons. She left it back on the porch rail and went inside. She did not think about what it meant that she had done that. By that afternoon, the drainage cut was half cleared, and the water was already beginning to move in the direction Hector had predicted. Rebecca stood at the edge of the south pasture and watched two of the younger hands coaxing the flow with redirected brush dams. And she made 3 small corrections to the channel design, based on how the water was actually moving versus how she'd calculated it would move. And all 3 corrections worked. Tom Briggs watched her make the third one. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. "Watchik and my father build mill channels," she said. "Your father build good channels." "He built 3, she said. "I built 2 of them." Tom Briggs chewed on that for a moment. "Huh," he said. "Huh," she said. By the following morning, the weakest cattle, the ones who had been losing ground at the troughs under the old distribution, were drinking their share. The improvement was small, it was real, and it was exactly where Crosswind Ranch needed it. That evening, while she was reviewing the final draft of the fraud summary, and Caleb was writing the letter to the county judge, there was a sound from the road, not the usual creak of the supply wagon, not the familiar rhythm of Hector's horse, a different sound. Heavier, more deliberate, with the particular quality of something that is not trying to be quiet, but is also not in any hurry. Caleb heard it at the same moment she did. He set down his pen. He went to the window. He stood there for a moment, very still, and then he turned around, and his face had that quality again, the compressed, contained quality that meant something was wrong, and he was deciding what to do about it. "There's a man at the gate," he said. "I don't recognize him. But he's riding a horse that's worth more than most men make in a year." Rebecca looked up from her papers. "Is he alone?" she asked. "He's alone," Caleb said. "But he's carrying a leather satchel. The kind lawyers carry." Rebecca looked at the documents on the table, her 6 pages of organized evidence. The fraud summary, the cross-referenced survey, the numbered invoices with her father's signature. She looked at Caleb. "How much of this can you commit to memory in the next 5 minutes?" she said. "Enough," he said. "Then go let him in," she said. "And let me keep working while you talk to him." Caleb looked at her steadily for one long moment. Then he picked up his hat and went to the door. The man at the gate was not Vernon Shaw. She established that quickly when voices reached her through the window, voices that had the particular quality of men assessing each other across a narrow social distance. But whoever he was, he had documents, and he was explaining their purpose in the smooth, careful tone of someone who had been told exactly what to say and had rehearsed it enough times to make it sound spontaneous. Rebecca kept her head down and her pen moving. She had 2 more invoices to reconcile, 1 more parcel number to verify, and a timeline to complete. Whatever was happening at the gate, she intended to be ready for it. Because Vernon Shaw was coming, Caroline had said so. And Rebecca had learned, in the past week, that the only thing that beat a carefully constructed scheme was a more carefully constructed truth one twain that had been assembled with patience, precision, and absolutely no room for doubt. She had 4 pages left to write. She wrote them. The man at the gate was named Aldrich. He introduced himself as a legal representative of Shaw Cattle and Land Holdings. And he had the particular manner of men who deliver bad news on behalf of other men, smooth, practiced, deliberately pleasant, in the way of someone who has been paid to remain pleasant, regardless of how the conversation goes. Caleb let him in. He did not offer him coffee. Rebecca stayed at the table and kept writing, but she had angled her chair so that she could see the doorway, and she listened to every word. Aldrich opened his satchel on the porch and produced a document that he described as a notice of lien, a legal claim, he explained, against the assets of Crosswind Ranch, arising from an outstanding debt of $4,200 owed by one Josiah Hale to Shaw Cattle and Land Holdings. A debt secured, according to Mr. Shaw's records, by the original courtship payment made by Caleb Rourke to the Hale family some 6 months prior. Caleb was quiet through all of this. Rebecca could see the back of him through the doorway, the particular stillness she had learned to read. The kind that meant he was absorbing information rather than reacting to it, filing it away with the cold precision of someone who intended to use it. "What does the lien cover?" Caleb said. "The cattle herd, the water rights, and the primary ranch structures," Aldrich said. He said it gently, the way you say something terrible when you've been paid to say it gently. "Mr. Shaw is prepared to be flexible about the timeline. Of course. He has a great deal of respect for what you've built here, Mr. Rourke. He simply wants what he is owed, and what would satisfy the lien. Either repayment of the full amount within 30 days, Aldrich said, or completion of the original marriage agreement between yourself and Miss Caroline Hale, which would transfer the debt obligation back to the Hale estate." Rebecca's pen stopped moving. She made herself start it again. "I see," Caleb said. The same 2 words he'd used at the depot, with the same quality of absolute contained stillness. "And if I do neither, then Mr. Shaw will be compelled to begin proceedings to attach the assets listed in the lien," Aldrich said. "I want to emphasize that this is not Mr. Shaw's preferred outcome. He is a reasonable man. He's a thief," Caleb said, very quietly, without heat. Aldrich's pleasantness did not waver. "I understand this is difficult news, Mr. Rourke. I'll leave the documents with you. Mr. Shaw himself will call within the week to discuss options." He closed the satchel with a small click. "Good evening." Caleb said nothing as the man rode away. He stood on the porch for a long moment after the hoofbeats faded. And then he came inside and closed the door and looked at Rebecca. She had stopped pretending to write. "You heard," he said. "All of it," she said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, heavily, with the weight of a man who has just had his worst suspicion confirmed and is deciding whether to be relieved that he knows or devastated that it's true. $4,200, he said. "That's not a coincidence. That's a number he chose. It's high enough that paying it immediately would strain the ranch's operating funds severely, especially in a drought year. And if I can't pay it," He takes the water rights, Rebecca said, which, combined with the diversion he's already running upstream, would give him effective control of every drop of water in this valley. She looked at the documents on the table between them. Caleb, we need to talk about what we do with what I've found. We take it to the judge, he said. We could, she said. But if you pay Shaw, if you just make the debt go away, then your ranch is safe. The fraud continues, but Crosswind is safe. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. And Shaw finds his next target. Yes, she said. Whoever has the next piece of water he wants. And your father, my father, answers for nothing, she said. Her voice was steady. He helps Shaw destroy your ranch. He pockets whatever Shaw paid him, and he goes back to his mill and tells himself he had no choice. Caleb was quiet. If we take this to the judge, Rebecca said, it becomes public. The fraud, the diversion, the forged survey record, all of it. Including my father's role. She looked at him directly. I want you to understand what that means before we decide. It means my father faces legal consequences. It may mean the mill is seized. My family, what's left of it, will have very little. You'd do that, he said. Not a question. I already decided, she said, last night. I just wanted you to know what it costs. He held her gaze for a long moment, and something moved through his expression that she didn't have a name for yet, something that was neither pity nor admiration, but contained something of both and something else entirely that she was not ready to examine. We take it to the judge, he said. Then we need to move fast, she said. Shaw said he'd come within the week. I want to be at the county seat before he arrives here. Caleb nodded. He reached across the table and picked up the fraud summary she'd written. And he read it the way he read everything she produced, fully. Carefully, without skimming. This is good work, he said. It's enough to open an investigation, she said. Whether it's enough to stop Shaw before he does more damage, I don't know. It'll be enough, he said. He set the papers down. I'll send a wire to Judge Harmon's office first thing tomorrow. We can be in county seat by end of week if we leave Thursday. Rebecca nodded. She gathered the documents into their organized stack and began preparing the second copy she'd planned to make one for the judge. One to keep. Her hands were moving steadily, professionally. And she was not thinking about the fact that she had just committed to destroying her father in a court of law. She was not thinking about that at all. Then the door opened. Neither of them had heard a horse on the road. Neither of them had heard footsteps on the porch. One moment the door was closed, and the next it was open. And standing in the frame, travel dusty, hollow-eyed, more brittle than Rebecca had ever seen her, was Caroline Hale. Rebecca's pen hit the floor. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Caroline looked at Rebecca. Rebecca looked at Caroline. Caleb looked at both of them with the expression of a man who has processed a great deal of information in the past 2 weeks and has learned to hold his reactions back until he understands what he's looking at. You made it, Rebecca said finally. Her voice came out flat. I took the train the day after I sent the telegram, Caroline said. Her voice was not steady, which was unusual for Caroline, who had always been the composed one, the one who knew how to manage a room, how to make an entrance, how to be looked at. Right now she looked like someone who had used up every resource she had just getting to this doorway. I had to know you were all right. I'm all right, Rebecca said. Rebecca, I'm all right, Caroline. Something in her voice was not warm, and she did not try to make it warm. Caroline stepped inside. She looked at Caleb, and there was in her face something Rebecca hadn't expected, not calculation, not the social performance of beauty, just a plain, exhausted person who was about to say something she'd been dreading. Mr. Rourke, she said, I owe you an apology. I knew about the arrangement my father made. I knew he was in debt to Mr. Shaw. I discovered it about a month before I was supposed to travel west. And she stopped. I left. I went to Denver. I told myself I was refusing an unjust situation. But the truth is I was frightened, and I left without warning anyone. And when father couldn't send me, he sent me, Rebecca said. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Caroline looked at her sister. Her eyes were dry, which Rebecca thought she might never forgive her for, not the absence of tears exactly, but the control, even now, even here. Yes, Caroline said quietly. He sent you. Caleb stood up from the table. Miss Hale, he said to Caroline, you're welcome to stay the night. Maria will make up a room. He looked at Rebecca. I'm going to check on the drainage cut before it gets full dark. Give you time to, he gestured carefully at the space between the two sisters. I'll be back in an hour. He picked up his hat and went out. And Rebecca thought that this deliberate leaving of space, this precise understanding of what the moment required, was possibly the most considerate thing anyone had ever done for her. She looked at her sister. Caroline, sit down. Uninvited. In the chair Caleb had just vacated. How bad is it, she said. Meaning the fraud. Meaning the lien. Meaning all of it. Bad, Rebecca said. How much do you know? I know Father took money from Shaw. I know he signed things he shouldn't have. I found letters, I didn't understand all of them. But I kept them. She reached into the bag she was carrying and produced a folded packet of papers tied with kitchen string. I brought them. Rebecca looked at the packet. She picked it up, untied the string, and opened the first letter. It took her less than a minute to understand what she was holding. Her father's handwriting. Shaw's replies in the formal, measured language of a man who was very careful about what he put in writing. Dates going back 18 months, references to payments. References to the adjustment of Survey Parcel 47. References, in one letter, to the arrangement with Rourke being useful for purposes of establishing the debt instrument. Her father hadn't just signed fraudulent invoices. He had known. From the beginning, he had known that Shaw's plan was to use the courtship payment as the basis for a fraudulent lien against Crosswind Ranch, which meant the arrangement with Caleb, the whole courtship agreement, had never been about finding a husband for Caroline. It had been Shaw's mechanism for creating the debt, and her father had participated willingly. Rebecca set the letters down. Her hands were steady. She was distantly aware that this was remarkable. Rebecca, Caroline said. Don't, Rebecca said. I need to, yet, Rebecca said. I need a minute. Caroline was quiet. Rebecca sat with what she'd just read, with the weight of it, with the particular quality of betrayal that doesn't make a sound when it lands, but takes up all the space in the room anyway. She had known her father was capable of using her. She had known it since she was 17, and understood that he thought of her as the practical daughter, the useful one, the one you sent when sending someone was necessary. She had known it. She had not known he was capable of this. She had not known that the one-way ticket west, the worn valises, the letter bearing her sister's name, that all of it was not just his desperation, but his deliberate collaboration, who ended in the destruction of a man who had done nothing except try to build something honest. Where did you get these? She asked. Her voice was different now. Quieter. The anger was there, but it was for below the surface. The way the hottest fire is often the quietest. His desk, Caroline said. The night before I left for Denver, I was looking for money. I found these instead. And you took them. I didn't know exactly what they meant, Caroline said. I knew they were bad. I knew he was involved in something with Shaw that wasn't right. But I was so frightened, Rebecca. I didn't know what to do with them. And I didn't know who to tell, and she stopped. I took them, and I left. You took the evidence, Rebecca said. And you left me behind. Silence, yes, Caroline said. It was the most honest thing Rebecca had ever heard her sister say. Rebecca picked up the letters again. She read through them a second time. More slowly, extracting everything useful. Shaw's handwriting. Specific dates. The parcel number 47. Matching the one she'd found in the ledgers. One letter, the most recent, mentioned a third party in Cheyenne who had redrawn the survey maps. A name, Dillard. She wrote the name at the bottom of her fraud summary. Those letters, she said, are the most important evidence we have. Then they should be yours, Caroline said immediately. They're going to the county judge, Rebecca said. along with everything else I've put together this week. She looked at her sister. If we present this case and it holds, and I believe it will hold, Father will face charges. The mill may be seized. He will not escape this. Caroline absorbed this. I know, she said. I want to make sure you understand what that means. I understand it, Caroline said quietly. Rebecca, I've been living with what I did for 2 months. I know what I owe. I know what Father owes. Her voice held something Rebecca hadn't heard in it before, not sophistication, not social grace, but something rawer and more genuine. I came here because I thought maybe I could help fix it. Even a little. Rebecca looked at her sister for a long moment, really looked, in the way she hadn't let herself do in years, past the beauty that had always made her feel insufficient, and past the fear she'd been carrying, and into the face of the person underneath all of that. Caroline was frightened. She had been frightened for months. And she had come anyway. It wasn't enough. It wasn't close to enough. But it was something. I'll tell you what I need from you, Rebecca said. And you'll do it without argument. Yes, Caroline said. You'll write a sworn statement about finding those letters. You'll testify to their origin and the context in which you found them. You'll answer every question the judge asks, regardless of what it reveals about Father. Yes, Caroline said again. And you'll understand, Rebecca said, that I am not ready to forgive you. That's not me being cruel. That's me being honest. Something moved across Caroline's face, a flicker of pain that she did not try to hide or manage. I know, she said. Good, Rebecca said. She picked up her pen. Now sit down and tell me everything you remember about those letters. Every detail, every name. Caroline sat and she talked. And Rebecca wrote, and the night deepened around Crosswind Ranch. And when Caleb came back from the drainage cut, an hour later, he found the two sisters at the dining room table, with documents spread between them, and the particular focused energy of people who have found their shared purpose and are moving toward it. He looked at Rebecca, she looked at him. Letters, she said. From my father to Shaw, going back 18 months. They prove prior knowledge of the fraud. She held up the packet. And there's a name, Dillard, in Cheyenne, who drew the altered survey maps. Caleb was quiet for exactly 1 second. Now we have a case, he said. Now we have a case, she confirmed. He pulled up a chair and sat down and picked up the first letter. And the three of them worked through the night. But it was the storm that undid everything. 2 days later, the day before they had planned to leave for the county seat, the storm came from the northwest with the particular ferocity of Wyoming summer thunder that builds fast and hits hard and gives you almost no warning. The sky had been strange all afternoon, the light wrong. The air too, still, and by late evening the thunder was close enough to feel in the floorboards. Hector came to the door at 9:30, soaked through. His expression carrying the specific gravity of a man reporting a catastrophe. Spill gates down, he said. The northern one. The temporary one we put up to hold the bypass channel. He looked at Caleb. It didn't just fail. Someone cut the support posts. 3 of them clean through. Storm took the rest. Rebecca was already on her feet. The bypass channel, she said. Without the spill gate, water's running free into the lower pasture, Hector said. We've got maybe 2 hours before it floods the south fence line. The herd's down there, boss. 300 head. Caleb was already moving toward the door, pulling on his coat, his expression that compressed. Purposeful thing that had no room for anything except the immediate problem. He paused in the doorway and looked at Rebecca. She was already thinking. She was thinking about the drainage cut, about the way she'd watched the water move 3 days ago, the way it had taken the path she'd predicted. She was thinking about the old mill channels her father had built, the emergency overflow cuts, the ones dug at an angle to redirect surge water away from the wheel housing when the creek ran too high. Hector, she said, the abandoned drainage cut, the eastern one, the one you cleared. Which direction does it slope at the far end? Hector stared at her for a half second. Southeast, he said, toward the old dry wash. If we open the far end, she said. All the way remove whatever's blocking the outlet. The surge water from the lower pasture will flow east instead of pooling against the fence line. Hector looked at Caleb. It'll work, Caleb said, if we can get to the outlet in time. Take 2 men, Rebecca said. The outlet is the priority. Caleb, she turned to him. And she did not waste words. The herd needs to move to higher ground. The upper north pasture. Can you? Yes, he said. He was already out the door. She grabbed her coat and followed Hector into the rain. What happened in the next 2 hours was not heroic in the way of stories told afterward. It was wet and exhausting, and twice she nearly lost her footing in the mud. And the water in the lower pasture was already thigh-deep on the cattle by the time Hector's crew found the drainage outlet and began pulling the debris that silted back in at the far end. She stood in the rain and directed them by voice, calling out where to dig, where to reinforce the channel wall with whatever boards they could grab from the supply shed, watching the water level and calculating how much time they had. She had seen her father do this, once manage a spring flood at the mill, redirecting surge water with improvised channels and a tremendous amount of shouting. She had been 12 years old, and she had stood at the edge of the chaos and understood, clearly and permanently, that water did not negotiate. It went where it was directed, or it went where it wanted, and the only variable you controlled was which. Open it, she called to Hector. When the outlet was clear enough, all the way, Hector swung his shovel into the remaining earth berm. The water moved. It didn't rush, it shifted, the way water does when you give it a choice that is slightly better than the one it had. A kind of slow, massive turning in the direction of least resistance. She watched it go, and she kept watching until she was sure it was tracking east. Sure it was following the channel and not finding new routes. And then she exhaled for what felt like the first time in 2 hours. From the north pasture, she could hear cattle, the particular sound of a herd being moved in a hurry. Men's voices and hooves on wet ground, and Caleb's voice above all of it, clear and steady, directing the hands. By sunrise, the water level in the lower pasture was dropping. The cattle were on high ground, cold and agitated but alive. The spill gate was destroyed, the temporary bypass system was compromised, and the drainage cut was working. Standing at the edge of the south pasture fence, watching the water recede, Rebecca became aware that 3 of the neighboring ranchers had ridden over in the early morning hours when they saw the water movement and the lantern lights, and understood that something had gone wrong at Crosswind. They had come to help not because they had any obligation to, but because that was what neighbors did in Wyoming territory when the weather turned hostile, and they had arrived in time to see the tail end of the crisis. They had also seen, in the gray pre-dawn light, something else. Something that 2 of them recognized immediately. A diversion channel, cut into the creek bank upstream of Crosswind's intake gate, built with timber and Watergate hardware, running toward Shaw's property line. It wasn't hidden anymore. The storm had exposed it, washed away the brush cover, undercut the bank, left the channel sitting there in plain sight with Shaw's timber marks still legible on the framework posts. One of the ranchers, a man named Garrett, whose property sat half a mile east of Crosswind, looked at the exposed channel for a long time. Then he looked at Caleb. "That's on Shaw's side of the survey line," Garrett said. "Yes," Caleb said. "That channel's been running long enough that the banks are established," Garrett said. "That's not recent work." "No," Caleb said. "It's not." Garrett looked at the other 2 ranchers. A look passed between them that Rebecca recognized from her father's mill, the look of men who have just understood that something they thought was a weather problem is actually a human one, and that the weather was just the mechanism. "My creek levels have been down this summer," Garrett said slowly. "I blamed the drought." "So did I," said the second rancher. The third said nothing. He was looking at the timber marks on the channel framework, and his expression was the quiet, cold expression of a man adding numbers. Caleb said, "I've got documents at the house, evidence of exactly how long this has been running and who built it. I'd like you to see them if you're willing, before I take them to the county judge." All three men said yes. They came inside, rain-wet and muddy, and they sat at the dining room table, and Rebecca laid out the evidence in the sequence she had organized: the ledgers, the survey maps, the altered parcel record, the fraudulent invoices, and finally the letters from her father to Shaw. She presented it calmly and completely, the way she had practiced it in her head for the judge. She answered questions when asked. She pointed to the specific entries, the specific dates, the specific numbers. When she finished, Garrett said, "Who put this together?" "I did," she said. He looked at her, then he looked at Caleb, then back at her. "You've been here, what, 2 weeks?" he said. 10 days, she said. Another silence. "You said there's a name," the second rancher said. "Dillard. In Cheyenne. The man who drew the false survey." "Yes," Rebecca said. "I know a Dillard in Cheyenne," the man said. "Works at the land office annex. Does survey work on the side." He paused. "I never trusted him. It was the testimony of men who had been living next to a crime they hadn't known was a crime, and finding out that their instincts about a man had been right all along too late." "But right. We're going to the county judge Thursday," Caleb said. "I'd like you to come." "We'll come," Garrett said. Rebecca picked up her pen and added their names to the document. Then, while the ranchers and Caleb were talking, she heard the road again. Not the sound of the storm aftermath, not branches, not runoff, hoofbeats, multiple horses moving at a deliberate pace. She went to the window. There were 4 riders at the gate. The one in front was not Aldrich. He was heavier, older, with the particular bearing of a man who had spent his life purchasing things and was accustomed to completing the transaction. He wore a good coat despite the mud. He carried no legal satchel, which was somehow more alarming than if he had. She had never seen Vernon Shaw before, but she knew him the way you sometimes know a thing that you've been preparing for. She turned from the window and looked at Caleb, who had seen the riders too. He was already standing. Garrett said yes, Caleb said. The room went very quiet. Rebecca looked at her evidence stack. Complete, organized, copied twice, with one copy already sealed in the envelope for Judge Harmon's office. She looked at Caleb. "You ready?" she said. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. "I've been ready," he said. He went out to the porch, and Rebecca gathered the documents and stood behind him in the doorway where Shaw could see her. And Vernon Shaw rode up to the gate of a ranch he had spent 14 months trying to destroy, and he looked at the man standing on the porch and the woman beside him and the 3 neighboring ranchers visible through the window. And for the first time, something in his carefully managed expression showed the first crack of a man who has arrived expecting to finalize a purchase, and instead found that the property has been defended. He had not planned on Rebecca Hale, nobody had, but here she was, and the evidence in her hands was the most complete and precise accounting of his fraud that existed anywhere. And Vernon Shaw was about to find out exactly what happened when you underestimated a woman who had spent her entire life being told she was only useful. She was useful, and in that moment, standing in the doorway of a ranch she had helped save, with the truth organized in her hands and her father's betrayal behind her, and an uncertain future ahead of her. That word useful meant something entirely different than it ever had before. She stood her ground, and she waited for what came next. Vernon Shaw dismounted with the unhurried ease of a man who had never once in his life arrived anywhere and found the door closed to him. He handed his reins to one of the riders behind him without looking, the way you hand something to furniture, and he walked toward the porch with his hands in plain sight and a pleasant expression that had been calibrated over many years to communicate reasonable authority. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at Caleb. Then he looked at Rebecca. Then he looked at the 3 ranchers visible through the front window, and something in his pleasant expression recalculated, very slightly, the way a man adjusts his footing when the ground shifts under him. "Mr. Rourke," he said, "I apologize for the early hour. I heard about the storm damage last night. I wanted to come personally to offer whatever assistance I could. That's generous, Caleb said. Neighborly, Shaw said. Nothing more. He glanced at Rebecca again. Longer this time. I don't believe we've met, Rebecca Hale, she said. I'm the bookkeeper. Something moved in Shaw's eyes, a flicker of assessment. Gone almost before it appeared. Hale, he said. Any relation to Josiah Hale? His daughter, she said. Shaw absorbed this with a nod that revealed nothing. Small world, he said. Smaller than you planned for, Caleb said. The pleasantness in Shaw's expression held, but only by effort now she could see the effort. The slight compression around his jaw, the way his eyes moved one more time to the documents she was holding. I heard Aldrich visited yesterday, Shaw said. I want you to know I take no pleasure in the legal formalities. The lien is a protective measure, nothing punitive. I'm confident we can work something out that satisfies everyone. Come inside, Caleb said. It was not warm, and it was not an invitation. It was the opening move in something that had already been decided. Shaw came up the steps and through the door, and his 3 riders stayed with the horses. And when he saw the full spread of documents on the dining room table, the organized stacks, the labeled ledgers, the copied letters, the survey maps laid side by side, his walk slowed by exactly 1 step before he corrected it. Garrett and the other 2 ranchers stood up from where they'd been sitting. Shaw looked at them. He looked at the documents. He looked at Caleb. Gentlemen, he said, still pleasant. But the pleasantness was doing considerably more work now. Sit down, Shaw, Garrett said. He said it the way a man says something that isn't a request. Shaw sat. Rebecca set the document stack on the table in front of him and remained standing. She did not perform confidence. She had learned years ago that performed confidence looked exactly like what it was. She simply stood the way she stood when she was certain of her numbers, which was straight and still and without apology. I'm going to walk you through something, she said. I'd like you to let me finish before you speak. Shaw looked at her with the expression of a man deciding whether to be amused or alarmed, and landing somewhere between the two. By all means, he said. She took him through it in order, the fraudulent invoices, the duplicate freight charges, the 4 supply categories she had traced back 14 months. She showed him the parcel reclassification, the 16-acre strip along the creek boundary, resurveyed and reclassified as disputed public land, with the notary stamp from the county land office and the name Dillard attached to it. She showed him the survey maps, original and amended, side by side, and she pointed to the 40-yard discrepancy in the intake gate location with the same calm she would have used explaining a freight manifest. Then she put Josiah Hale's letters on the table. Shaw looked at the letters. His face did not collapse. He was too experienced for that. But the pleasant expression finally stopped working, and what was underneath it was not rage and not fear, but something colder and more calculating, the expression of a man who has just discovered that the game has changed and is deciding whether to fold or bluff. He chose to bluff. Those letters, he said carefully, are private correspondence, whatever Josiah Hale has told his daughter. The letters are in your handwriting, Rebecca said. And his both. I've read them enough times to know every word. She held his gaze. They reference the parcel number. They reference the debt instrument. They reference, and I'm quoting the arrangement with Rourke being useful for purposes of establishing the lien. That's not Josiah Hale's interpretation, Mr. Shaw. That's your sentence, in your hand, silence. Garrett shifted in his chair. The sound was small, but it filled the room. The diversion channel upstream, the second rancher said. His voice was flat and deliberate. The one your property line runs along. The one that was exposed by last night's storm. We all saw it this morning. Shaw said nothing. My creek levels have been low all summer, Garrett said. I wrote it off to drought. Now I'm thinking differently. Shaw looked at Caleb. He had stopped looking at Rebecca, which she understood was a choice, an attempt to reframe the room around the man he'd expected to be dealing with. To make this a negotiation between men instead of a reckoning with evidence. Caleb, he said, and his voice had shifted lower, more personal, stripped of the pleasant professional layer. You're a reasonable man. Whatever these documents suggest, there are explanations. I've always had respect for what you've built here. I came here today because I wanted to find a way through this that didn't require Vernon, Caleb said. Shaw stopped. Look at the woman, Caleb said. She's the one you need to talk to. Something crossed Shaw's face then, something that was not pleasant and not calculated but purely, briefly real. Surprise. Genuine surprise. The kind that comes from a deep assumption being violated. He looked at Rebecca. She met his gaze and she did not fill the silence. The county judge, she said, will receive a complete copy of everything on this table by end of this week. That copy will include the letters, the survey evidence, the ledger documentation, and sworn statements from Mr. Rolfe and 3 neighboring landowners. She nodded toward Garrett without looking away from Shaw. It will also include the name Dillard and the specific survey work he performed for you in Cheyenne last spring. I have been thorough, Mr. Shaw. I want you to know that. Shaw was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, What do you want? I want you to withdraw the lien, Rebecca said. Today, in writing. And I want you to provide a full accounting to the county court of the water diversion, the fraudulent invoices, and the survey falsification. Whether you do that voluntarily or whether the judge compels you, the outcome is the same. The only variable is whether you cooperate. Another silence. And if I don't, Shaw said, you take this to the judge regardless. Yes, she said. He looked at the documents one more time. He looked at the 3 ranchers. He looked at Caleb, who was standing slightly behind Rebecca and to her left, which was not a coincidence. He had positioned himself there, deliberately. She realized, close enough to intervene if necessary, far enough back to make clear who was running this. Shaw put his hands flat on the table. I'll need to speak with my legal representative, he said. You have until Thursday morning, Rebecca said. That's when we leave for the county seat. Shaw stood. He straightened his coat with the automatic dignity of a man, reasserting the one thing he has left, which was his bearing. Miss Hale, he said. And there was something in the way he said her name, not threatening, but precise, as though he were filing it away. You came here as a substitute. I came here because my father sent me, she said. What I did after I arrived was my own choice. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he walked to the door, and he went out, and the sound of 4 horses moving away from Crosswind Ranch was the sound of something ending, not completely, not cleanly, but ending. Rebecca set the documents down and exhaled. Garrett was on his feet. We'll be at the county seat Thursday, he said. All 3 of us. Thank you, Caleb said. They left, and then it was just Caleb and Rebecca in the quiet of the dining room. And she sat down because her legs had decided that standing was no longer strictly necessary. And she pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. That was, Caleb started. I need a minute, she said. He sat down and gave her one. After a moment, she said, He'll cooperate. Not because he wants to. Because he did the same calculation I did and realized the evidence is too complete to fight. You knew that going in? I hoped it, she said honestly. Knowing would have required a different kind of nerve. He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to know well enough to understand, without translating the one that meant he was seeing her. Specifically her, not the sum of what she could do for him. Rebecca, he said. She looked up. When this is over, he said, I want to talk to you about staying. She held very still. As your bookkeeper, as he stopped, he started again. As whatever you want to be. I'm not making an offer. I'm not trying to replace one arrangement with another. He paused, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Crosswind, he looked genuinely uncertain. Not of the ranch, not of the situation, but of himself. I don't want you to leave, because the train is running and you feel obligated to get on it. Rebecca looked at him for a long moment. Ask me again, she said, when it's over. All right, he said. She picked up her pen. There were still documents to finalize. The hearing at the county seat happened on a Friday, in a low-ceilinged room that smelled of old paper and summer heat, with Judge Harmon behind a wide desk and Aldrich in the back row taking furious notes, and Shaw at a separate table with his legal representative, who had the expression of a man who had reviewed the evidence and understood precisely how limited his options were. Rebecca presented the case herself. Caleb had offered to do it, or to have his attorney do it, and she had said no, not because she doubted either of them, but because she had built this case. Every invoice, every date, every cross-referenced number existed in her mind, with the clarity of something she had personally understood, and no one would present it more accurately or more completely than she would. She stood at the front of that room, and she spoke for 40 minutes without notes, referencing the documents as she went, walking Judge Harmon through the fraud with the same organized precision she had used, walking the ranchers through it at Crosswind's dining room table. When she reached the letters, her father's letters, she did not hesitate. She read the relevant passages aloud in a clear, level voice, and she did not look at anyone while she read them, because looking at anyone would have required her to feel something about it in public, and she had decided that feeling things about her father was something she would do in private. Shaw's attorney offered 2 objections. Judge Harmon overruled both. When Rebecca finished, Garrett testified about the diversion channel and his own reduced creek levels. The second rancher confirmed the name Dillard and his knowledge of the man's survey work in Shantayan. Caleb testified about the original courtship payment and the sequence of events. Then Caroline stood up. Rebecca had not expected this. Caroline had said she would provide a written statement, and she had it was already in Judge Harmon's hands. But she stood up anyway, without being asked, and she said she wished to testify in person. And Judge Harmon, who had a daughter himself and who had watched Rebecca present her case with the kind of focused intelligence that he found too rare in any court, said she could. Caroline was composed. She was always composed. It was her particular and most reliable quality. But the composure today was different from the social composure Rebecca had watched her deploy her entire life. It was not performed. It was the composure of someone who had decided that the true thing needed to be said and had found, underneath her fear, the steadiness to say it. She explained how she found the letters. She explained what she understood and didn't understand about them. She explained, in plain language, that she left without warning and that her departure had directly resulted in her sister being sent west without full knowledge of the situation. She did not make it sound better than it was. She did not explain it in a way that sought sympathy. She said, "My silence cost other people. I'm here because the least I can do is speak now." Judge Harmon looked at her for a moment when she finished. Then he wrote something on his papers. The hearing concluded 3 hours after it started. Judge Harmon took 2 days to issue his ruling, and when it came, it was comprehensive. The fraudulent lien against Crosswind Ranch was canceled. Shaw's water diversion was ordered dismantled within 30 days at his own expense. The survey reclassification of Parcel 47 was reversed and the original boundary restored. A criminal referral was issued regarding the survey falsification, naming both Shaw and Dillard. Shaw's cattle contracts with 3 county buyers were suspended pending the criminal investigation, and Josiah Hale was ordered to appear before the court within 60 days to answer for his role in the fraud. Rebecca read the ruling sitting at the desk in their rented room at the county seat hotel, and she read it twice, and then she folded it carefully and set it down and looked at the wall for a while. Caroline was in the chair by the window. She had been watching her sister since they got the news, waiting in the way she had learned to wait quietly, without pressing. "He'll have to sell part of the mill," Rebecca said finally. "I know," Caroline said. "The family Shaw defrauded through the supply charges. There are at least 3 of them. The court will expect restitution. I know that too." Rebecca was quiet. "He's not a monster," she said. "He's a frightened man who made choices I'll never understand." "But he's not a monster." "No," Caroline said. "That almost makes it harder." "Yes," Caroline said simply. Rebecca picked up the ruling again. He should know what the ruling says before the official notice arrives. Someone should tell him. I'll go, Caroline said immediately. Rebecca looked at her sister. Not to protect him, Caroline said. Not to soften it. To tell him the truth plainly and let him respond to it. And because she paused, because it should be one of us. Not a stranger. Rebecca considered this for a long moment. Then she said, tell him that I'm not ready to see him. Tell him that doesn't mean I never will be. Tell him I need time. I will, Caroline said. And tell him, Rebecca stopped. She started again. Tell him that what he did to this ranch had consequences he didn't account for. That there are ranchers in that valley who almost lost their herds because of the water diversion. That it wasn't just about the money. I'll tell him, Caroline said. She left the next morning, and Rebecca sat alone in the hotel room for a while. And then she went downstairs and found Caleb waiting in the lobby with 2 cups of coffee. Because he had apparently understood that she would come downstairs when she was ready, and that the correct thing to do was be there with coffee when she did. She sat across from him at the small lobby table and wrapped both hands around the cup. Caroline's gone to see my father, she said. I know. I saw her leave. I'm not ready for that yet. That's your right, he said. No judgment. No suggestion that she should move faster toward forgiveness than she was capable of moving. She drank her coffee. He drank his. I want to ask you something, she said. All right, when this is over, when we're back at Crosswind and the water is restored and Shaw is answering to the court, what happens to the ranch? Practically. Financially. He looked at her. We recover. Slowly, but we recover. The drought's broken some of the herd. And we won't rebuild to full capacity this season. But the water rights are restored, the fraudulent charges stop. And the county water cooperative that Garrett's been pushing for the shared management system across all 5 valley ranches that moves forward now. He paused. Garrett told me last night he wants the cooperative to have a proper record keeper. Someone who understands water systems as well as ledgers. Rebecca was quiet. He was talking about you, Caleb said. Not me. I know who he was talking about, she said. It's a paid position, he said. Not connected to the ranch. Not connected to me, except that Crosswind is one of the 5-member ranches. You'd have your own income, your own standing in the valley. She looked at him steadily. You arranged that, I suggested it, he says. Garrett agreed immediately. It wasn't difficult to arrange. Why? He set his coffee cup down and looked at her with the directness she had come to understand was his most fundamental quality, the way he looked at difficult things rather than around them. Because I meant what I said at Crosswind, he said. I don't want you to stay because you feel you owe it to me, or because you have nowhere else to go, or because I saved your father from worse legal consequences by not pressing additional charges. He paused. I want you to have reasons to stay that are entirely yours. That have nothing to do with me. Rebecca felt something move in her chest, slow and large, like water finding its level. And then, she said. And then he said carefully, I'd like to court you. Properly. Without arrangements or bargains or financial instruments. He held her gaze. If that's something you'd consider. She looked at him for a long moment. I'll consider it, she said. And she did consider it. She considered it on the ride back to Crosswind, watching the Wyoming landscape move past with its indifferent magnitude. And she considered it over the following weeks as the water rights were restored and the diversion channel came down and the creek level at Crosswind's intake gate rose back toward where it should be. She considered it while she set up her records for the water cooperative in a rented office space in Sagebrush Crossing, a small room above the hardware store with a window that faced east, her name painted on the glass door in careful black letters. R. Hale, cooperative secretary, her own name on her own door, for work that was hers. She considered it on the Sunday mornings when Caleb walked beside her after church, not taking her arm, not performing the role of suitor, just walking beside her at the same pace, talking about the cattle or the water tables or something she'd read. treating her company as a thing he valued rather than a thing he was auditioning. He brought her a survey book she'd mentioned once, in passing. Not flowers. A survey book, because he had been paying attention to who she actually was. She considered it on the Wednesday evening when they disagreed seriously. Without performance about the water allocation formula she'd designed for the cooperative's first distribution cycle. He thought her formula weighted the larger ranches too heavily. She thought his objection was partly genuine and partly that he didn't want Crosswind to appear to receive preferential treatment. She said so directly. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You might be right. I usually am about the numbers," she said. "Yes," he said. "You usually are," and there was nothing condescending in it, and nothing defeated, just a man acknowledging a fact about a person he respected. She adjusted the formula anyway, because after reconsidering, she thought his instinct was correct, even if his reasoning was mixed. She told him she'd adjusted it, and why. He thanked her, and didn't make a thing of being right. This, she thought, was what it looked like when someone was genuinely trying. One afternoon she came home to the cooperative office, which she thought of as home now, more than the guest room at Crosswind, though she had continued to stay at the ranch, because the alternative was a boarding house in town, and the boarding house was considerably less comfortable, and she found Caroline in her office doorway. Caroline had been in Sagebrush Crossing for 3 weeks. She had taken a room above the dress shop owned by a woman named Mrs. Prue had, after 2 days of watching Caroline work, offered her a part-time position helping with alterations and design. She was learning to support herself. She was doing it imperfectly and with more difficulty than she'd expected. And she was doing it anyway. "I saw Father," Caroline said. Rebecca set down the papers she was carrying. "How is he?" "Frightened," Caroline said. "Older looking. He's been told what the court requires from him. He says he'll comply." She paused. "He asked about you. What did you tell him?" "That you were well," Caroline said. "That you had work. That you were managing better than anyone expected." She looked at her sister. "He said, and I'm telling you this because I think you should know, not because I'm asking you to feel anything about it. He said that he'd always known you were the stronger one. That he'd treated you as though being strong made you less valuable, when it was the most valuable thing about you." Rebecca looked at her office window, at her name on the glass. "That's not an apology," she said. "No," Caroline said, "it isn't. His apology came separately. It was longer, and I think it was genuine, and you can read it when you're ready." She held out a letter. "He wrote it himself." Rebecca looked at the letter. She did not take it yet. "Leave it on the desk," she said. "I'll read it when I'm ready." Caroline set it down carefully, like something that might break. "Rebecca," she said, "I know I don't have the right to ask this, but are you happy? Here, with the work and the town," and she stopped. "With everything?" Rebecca thought about the office and the survey book and the Sunday mornings and the Wednesday disagreement and the way the water cooperative records looked in her handwriting, organized, precise, reliable. She thought about a lantern left beside her ledgers. A repaired work glove left on a porch rail. "Ask me at the end of summer," she said. Caroline nodded. She went to the door, and then she paused. And without turning around, she said, "He's a good man, Rebecca. Not because he's perfect, because he's trying to be better." "I know that," Rebecca said. "I just wanted to say it," Caroline said, and she left. Rebecca sat alone in her office for a while. Then she picked up her pen and opened the cooperative ledger and went back to work. Because the records needed finishing, and because work was the thing she had always trusted most, and because some things needed to be felt slowly over time, before you could know what they were. Outside on the street below her window, Sagebrush Crossing went about its business in the late summer heat, and at the edge of town the road ran west toward Crosswind Ranch, and the creek that fed it was running at proper levels for the first time all summer, and somewhere at the end of that road a man was learning day by day, in small and deliberate ways, what it meant to try for something without trying to own it. She would decide, she thought, at the end of summer. But she already knew. She read her father's letter on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after Caroline left it on her desk. She had walked past it every day, twice on Monday, 3 times on Sunday, once late Friday night when she came back to the office to finish the cooperative's quarterly water allocation report, and the letter was still sitting there in the lamplight, exactly where Caroline had placed it, patient and unavoidable as a debt. She picked it up on Tuesday morning because she had run out of reasons not to. Her father's handwriting was familiar in the way of things that are both deeply known and deeply painful. The large confident loops she had watched, sign mill receipts and property deeds her entire life. The same hand that had signed the letter bearing Caroline's name and put her on a train west with 2 worn valises and a one-way ticket. She recognized it the way you recognize the sound of a voice that has said both kind and terrible things to you. That belongs to someone you cannot stop being the child of, no matter how old you get. He had written 4 pages. He began by saying he would not ask her to understand. He said he had spent enough of her life asking her to understand things that didn't deserve understanding. And he was done with that. He said that what he had done to Caleb Rourke was wrong in a way that he had told himself wasn't wrong while he was doing it. Because desperation has a way of making the wrong thing look like the only thing. And he had let it. He said the courtship payment had seemed, when Shaw first proposed the arrangement, like a solution to a problem that had been choking him for 2 years. He said he had not thought clearly about what it would mean for Caleb, or for Caroline, and here the handwriting changed slightly, became less steady for Rebecca. He said, I have always known you were the one who held things together. I told myself that meant you were strong enough to handle whatever I required of you. I understand now that I had it backwards. Strength is not the same as expendability. I made you bear the cost of my failures because I believed you could. That was the most unfair thing I have ever done to another person. And I have done many unfair things. He said he was cooperating fully with the court. He said he had contacted the 3 families affected by Shaw's fraudulent supply charges and had begun making arrangements for restitution. He said the mill would likely have to be sold in part, possibly in full, and that this was a consequence he accepted. He said, You don't have to forgive me. You don't have to do anything at all. But I wanted you to know that when I think about what you did, what you built, what you found, what you proved, I feel something I don't have a clean word for. It's pride, but it's the kind that hurts, because I know I had nothing to do with it. You did that yourself. You've always done things yourself. I just made it harder than it needed to be. The last line was, I hope Wyoming is kind to you. You deserve a place that treats you the way your work deserves to be treated. Rebecca set the letter down. She sat with it for a while with the complicated, uncomfortable weight of a document that was not enough and was also, genuinely, something. Her father had not transformed himself into a different man overnight. He was still the man who had signed those invoices, who had put her on that train, who had looked at his 2 daughters and calculated their value in the ways of a man whose fear had made him transactional about the people he should have protected. But he was also the man who had written 4 pages without asking for anything. She folded the letter and put it in the drawer of her desk, in the back behind the cooperative bylaws and the survey maps. Not thrown away, not displayed, filed in the way of important documents that require time before their final use can be determined. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the quarterly report, because the report was due Friday and the numbers needed finishing. She was halfway through the 3rd page when there was a knock at her office door. She said, Come in, expecting Caroline or Garrett or one of the cooperative members with a question about their allocation. She was not expecting Caleb, who had never come to her office before, who had, in the careful, deliberate way of a man honoring an agreement he'd made with himself, kept the courtship confined to the neutral spaces of Sunday mornings and shared meals, and the occasional evening on Crosswind's porch, and she was certainly not expecting Caleb with his hat in his hands, and an expression she had never seen on him before. He looked not nervous exactly, because nervous implied uncertainty about outcome, and this was something different. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was fully inside it and was about to find out whether it was the right one. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He put his hat on the corner of her desk, which was the first time he'd ever set anything on her desk, and the small presumption of it told her something about the state he was in. "The harvest dance is Saturday," he said. "I know," she said. "I'd like you to come with me." She looked at him steadily. "You've walked me to church 3 Sundays in a row. This is different," he said. "The dance is." He paused, choosing words with the care of someone who has thought about this long enough that the words are not spontaneous. But the feeling behind them is. The whole valley will be there. Garrett and the cooperative members, the hands from Crosswind, everyone who knew about the situation with Shaw, and everyone who didn't, and everyone who drew their own conclusions about why a woman arrived at my ranch under unusual circumstances, and then stayed. He held her gaze. "I want to walk in with you, not to make a statement about anything, not to answer anyone's questions or manage anyone's opinion." He paused again. "Because you're the person I want to walk in with." Rebecca was quiet. "That's not a proposal," he said quickly. "I know it isn't," she said. I know what it is, Caleb." He was quiet then, and she let the quiet sit for a moment while she considered him, this man, who had driven an hour to collect a woman he'd never met, discovered he'd been deceived, and responded by picking up her heavy bag. This man who had apologized for what his face had shown before his words caught up. Who had said, "What do you need from me?" and meant it every single time. Who had given her wages and work and a desk and a door with her name on it, and had then stepped back and let those things be hers without attaching himself to them. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, yes. I'll come to the dance with you." She looked back at her report. "I have to finish this quarterly allocation first." "Of course," he said. He stood and picked up his hat. He was almost to the door when she said his name. He turned. "The survey book you brought me," she said. "The water systems manual. I used 3 of the channel designs in the cooperative's distribution plan." He nodded. "Thank you," she said, "for knowing that was what I actually wanted." Something shifted in his expression, that brief, unguarded thing that changed his face, gone before she could examine it fully. "I've been paying attention," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I said yes." He went out, and she heard his footsteps on the stairs. And she sat for a moment with the particular quality of a feeling she was only now, after 36 years of believing she wasn't the kind of woman this happened to, allowing herself to name. Then she went back to the quarterly report. Because the numbers needed finishing, and she was, above all else, a woman who finished what she started. Saturday arrived with the particular clarity of late Wyoming summer, the heat still present but different now, with the first suggestion of autumn behind it, the light at a different angle than it had been in July. Rebecca wore the dress she had made herself in the evenings over the past 3 weeks, a deep blue, the color she had always wanted and never permitted herself, cut with the simple, clean lines that suited her and no one else's idea of what suited her. She wore her mother's ribbon in her hair. She had carried it west in the bottom of her smaller valise, wrapped around a spare hairpin, and she had not worn it since she arrived, because she hadn't been sure she was ready to wear something that mattered. She was ready now. Caleb was at the foot of the cooperative office stairs when she came down, and he looked at her in the direct, honest way. He looked at everything, no performance of admiration, no elaborate compliment designed to make her feel managed. He simply looked at her the way a person looks at something that is genuinely good. "That color," she said. "It suits you." "I know," she said. "I made it myself." He smiled, the real one, the brief, unguarded one, and offered his arm. And she took it, and they walked to the dance together in the late summer evening with the ease of 2 people who have already had the difficult conversations and arrived somewhere on the other side of them. The Sagebrush Crossing Harvest Dance was held in the big open barn at the edge of town that was used for every event, requiring more space than the town hall could provide. By the time Rebecca and Caleb arrived, it was already full ranch families and townspeople and cooperative members, and a fiddle player setting up in the corner with the focused energy of someone about to do the thing they loved best. Rebecca felt the room register their entrance. Not dramatically, no one stopped or stared in the conspicuous way of gossip made visible. But she had spent enough of her life being assessed by rooms to know when it was happening, and this room was doing it, in the subtle, continuous way of a community that has been watching a situation develop and has opinions. She had opinions too. She kept them to herself and scanned the room for Caroline, who she found near the refreshment table talking with Mrs. Pruitt, wearing a dress that was simpler than anything Rebecca had ever seen her wear, and looking, despite this or because of it, more genuinely herself. Garrett found them before the first dance. He shook Caleb's hand and then turned to Rebecca and said, "The quarterly report is excellent work, Miss Hale. 3 of the member ranches asked me separately to tell you so. I'll pass their comments along to my desk," she said, "where they'll be very appreciated." He laughed a real laugh, surprised out of him, and moved on. Tom Briggs appeared at Caleb's shoulder, trail clean for the occasion, and gave Rebecca a nod that contained more respect than most men managed with a full sentence. "Water allocation held through last week's dry spell," he said to her. "Just like your calculations said." "I know," she said. "I saw the trough reports." "Huh," he said. She said. He moved away, satisfied, and Caleb looked at her sidelong. "Do you always do that to him?" "He respects it," she said. "He doesn't want to be flattered. He wants to know the person he's talking to understands the work. He told me 2 weeks ago," Caleb said, "that you were the best bookkeeper we've ever had. That includes every bookkeeper Crosswind has had in 12 years. "I know that too," she said. "He told me himself." Caleb looked at her. "Was that before or after the water allocation report?" "After," she said. "He's consistent." The fiddle started, and the room rearranged itself toward the dancing. Caleb turned to her, and the question was in his face before he'd said a word. And she answered it before he could ask it. "Yes," she said. He took her hand and led her to the floor. She was not a practiced dancer. She had attended few enough dances in her life that her steps were careful rather than automatic. And she told him so plainly in the first 8 bars. And he said he would not win any competitions himself. And they found a rhythm together that was imperfect and comfortable and entirely theirs. It was in the second dance that she saw her father. He was standing near the barn door, not inside at the edge, as though he hadn't decided yet whether to come in. He was thinner than she remembered. He was watching her, and when she met his eyes, he did not look away, which told her the letter had cost him something, and he intended to stand behind what it said. She danced the full second dance without stopping. She kept her eyes on Caleb's shoulder, and she breathed, and she felt the complicated weight of it, the anger and the sadness and the stubborn, inconvenient love that doesn't disappear just because someone has hurt you. When the song ended, she said to Caleb quietly, "My father is here." He looked toward the door. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Give me a moment." He stepped back without question, and she stood in the middle of the dance floor while couples moved around her. And she looked at her father, standing at the edge of the barn with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who knows he is not owed anything, and has come anyway because some things require showing up regardless. She walked to the door. He watched her come. When she reached him, they stood facing each other for a moment without speaking, which was something they had always done, both of them, more comfortable with precision than preamble. "You came," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd want me to," he said. "But I thought not coming was the wrong choice." "It was," she said. "The wrong choice would have been not coming." He looked at her, at the blue dress, at the ribbon in her hair, at the woman standing in front of him with the straightness of someone who has built her own ground to stand on. "You look," he stopped. Started again. "You look like your mother," he said. and his voice was unsteady for the first time. She used to wear that color. Rebecca felt something move in her chest. I know, she said. That's why I chose it. He was quiet for a moment. The letter, I read it, she said. Rebecca, not tonight, she said. It was not cruel. It was honest in the way she had promised herself she would always be from here on. I'm not ready for that conversation tonight, but I'm glad you came. She paused. That's real. I'm genuinely glad you came, he nodded. His jaw worked briefly, the way it did when he was holding something in. I'll be here, he said. Whenever you're ready. I'll be here, she nodded once. Then she turned and walked back into the dance, and she did not look back at the door. Because she had said what was true, and she intended to let it be enough for tonight. Caleb was where she'd left him. He didn't ask. He simply fell into step beside her and handed her a cup of cider that he'd gotten from somewhere during her absence. And she took it and drank it and felt the evening settle back into something manageable. Thank you, she said. For the cider? For not asking. I figured you'd tell me what you wanted me to know, he said. I will, she said. Later's fine, he said. The fiddle started again, faster this time, and Caroline appeared from the direction of the refreshment table and gave Rebecca a look that was half question and half relief. And Rebecca gave her a small nod that meant yes, I spoke to him. And Caroline's shoulders dropped about half an inch. And that small exchange between sisters held more than most conversations. It was during the fourth dance, a slower one, the kind that gives you room to talk if you want to, and room not to if you don't, that Caleb said, without preamble, I have something to ask you. Rebecca looked at him. The cooperative is establishing its permanent office next month, he said. Garrett's confirmed the funding. The secretary position becomes full-time and salaried as of October 1st. I know, she said. I wrote the position description. You wrote yourself a job, he said. I wrote the cooperative a competent secretary, she said. It happens to be me, Rebecca. Caleb. They looked at each other. And, in the lamplight of the harvest, dance with the fiddle, moving through its slow pattern and the room full of the people who had watched this story develop from the outside. She saw in his face the thing he was working toward and decided not to make him work quite so hard for it. Ask me, she said. He was quiet for a moment, finding the words. And when he found them, they were not elegant. They were not the words of a man who had rehearsed a proposal. They were the words of a man saying the truest thing he knew. You came here because your father sent you, he said. You stayed because you chose to. Everything you've built here, the office, the cooperative records, the position, your name on that door, that's yours. I had no part in it. He paused. I don't want to complicate any of that. I don't want to be something you accepted because it came with the territory. His hands were steady, but his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, not uncertainty exactly, but something close to it, the particular quality of a man who knows exactly what he wants and understands that wanting it gives him no claim to it. I want to be something you chose, separately, deliberately, because you want to. The music moved around them. I was sent here in my sister's place, she said. I know, he said. I arrived with 2 worn bags and a letter bearing someone else's name. And I stood on that platform and told you I wasn't what you expected, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. I remember, he said. And you picked up my heavy bag, she said. Something shifted in his face. You noticed that, he said. I notice everything, she said. You know that about me. I do, he said. She held his gaze, this man who had apologized for what his face had shown, who had asked her what she needed and meant it, who had given her work and wages and a door with her name on it, and then stepped back and let those things be entirely hers. My heart, she said quietly, chose you somewhere around the second ledger. I just needed the rest of me to catch up. He stopped moving. Around them the other couples kept dancing, and the fiddle kept playing. And the late summer night pressed against the barn walls with the first breath of autumn somewhere underneath the warmth. And Caleb Rourke looked at Rebecca Hale in her deep blue dress with her mother's ribbon in her hair, and he looked at her the way you look at something you have been trying not to want too much in case you couldn't have it. And now you can have it, and the relief and the joy of that are almost too large to hold without spilling. Yes, he said, just that word. Yes, she said, deliberately. Because I want to. He brought her hand up and held it, and they stood still in the middle of the turning dance floor. And then he smiled, the real one, the full one, the one that changed his whole face, and she smiled back. And it was not the smile of a woman who had been rescued or settled or made to feel lucky to be chosen. It was the smile of a woman who had done the choosing. They married at the end of summer on a Saturday morning beside the restored creek at Crosswind Ranch. Not a large ceremony. Not a performed one. The cooperative members came, and the ranch hands, and Garrett, and Mrs. Pruitt, and Caroline in a dress of her own making, cream linen with simple lines, more beautiful for its simplicity than anything she'd worn in her previous life. Josiah Hale stood at the edge of the gathering. He had not been invited, and he had not been turned away. He stood where he could see but not intrude, and when the ceremony ended, and Rebecca walked back from the creek with her hand in Caleb's, she stopped when she reached him. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I'm not ready for everything, but I'm ready for this." She hugged him briefly. Once, the way you hug someone you are in the process of deciding how to love again, which is different from the way you loved them before, and requires time to build, and cannot be rushed, and also cannot be abandoned. Because some ties don't break even when they should. He said nothing. He just held on for the moment she allowed. And then she stepped back and went to her husband. And Josiah Hale watched his daughter walk away toward the life she had built. And whatever he felt about it, he kept to himself. The wedding breakfast was loud and good-natured, which surprised Rebecca, who had expected something more formal, and she said so to Maria, who handed her a plate of biscuits and said that nothing at Crosswind had been formal since the second week of July. And did she plan to change that? No, Rebecca said. Good, Maria said. Formal is cold. Caroline found her near the end of the morning, after the breakfast had softened into conversation, and someone had brought out a fiddle, and the ranch hands had started something that was not quite dancing, but had the same energy. "Are you happy?" Caroline asked. The same question she'd asked in the office weeks ago. This time Rebecca didn't ask her to wait for the answer. Yes, she said simply, without qualification or caveat. Caroline's smile was the most genuine thing Rebecca had ever seen on her sister's face. Good, she said. You deserve uncomplicated happiness. Nothing about this is uncomplicated, Rebecca said. No, Caroline said. But the happiness is real. That's what matters. In the weeks that followed, Crosswind Ranch found its new rhythm different from what it had been before. Fuller in the way of places where voices are valued and decisions are made together. Rebecca kept the cooperative records and came home in the evenings with maps and figures, and the particular focused energy of a woman doing work she was genuinely good at. And Caleb kept the cattle and the land and came in from the range with the dust of Wyoming on his boots, and no apology for any of it. And they sat across from each other at the dining room table, the same table where the ledgers had first revealed the fraud, where they had worked through the night to build their case, and they talked about everything. Because that was the kind of marriage they had decided to have. Crosswind Ranch became something the valley had not quite seen before, known for its cattle. Yes, and for its fair water-sharing system, and for the cooperative that kept 5 ranches solvent through the following years, but also for something harder to name, for the quality of its decisions. For the fact that the people who worked there knew their voices were heard. For the ranch house that had once been silent and rigid and was now full of maps and books and conversation, and the smell of Maria's good bread and the sound of 2 people who had chosen each other deliberately, daily, without arrangement or obligation, because that was the only kind of choice that meant anything. Rebecca Hale had arrived at Sagebrush Crossing with 2 worn valises, a letter bearing her sister's name, and a father who had called her useful as though it were a lesser thing than beautiful. She knew now what she had always suspected but never been allowed to say, that useful in the hands of a woman who understood her own worth, was not a lesser thing at all. It was everything. She had come west as a substitute, sent by a man who did not see her clearly, into a life she had not chosen and a ranch she had never heard of. And she had looked at all of it, the ledgers, the fraud, the water, the man standing on the wagon's seat with his hat against the sun, and she had done what she always did. She had paid attention. She had done the work. She had built something true from the materials in front of her. And the cowboy, who had once driven an hour to meet a different woman, had learned, in the best and most permanent way a person can learn anything, that the woman who arrived was exactly the one his life had needed. He had not chosen her from a letter or a photograph or a financial arrangement. He had chosen her from her work, her honesty, her steady hands on a ledger in a lamplit room, her voice giving directions in the rain, her name on a glass door, her willingness to stand in front of a county judge and tell the truth at personal cost. And she had chosen him from a repaired glove and a filled lantern and a survey book, and the question asked more times than she could count, in more ways than words, "What do you need from me?" Love, Rebecca had come to understand, was not the thing her father had traded in, not a contract or an asset or a solution to a problem. It was not ownership or obligation or the result of a bargain made between desperate people in a back room. It was a choice, made freely, proven through respect, renewed every single day by two people who had decided that the other one was worth the work. And in the deep golden, unhurried certainty of that understanding, Rebecca Hale, cooperative secretary, ranch bookkeeper, builder of water channels and airtight legal cases, wife by her own deliberate choice, had finally, completely, and without reservation, come home.